Well, I think we're going to get started here. Technology is fun. So I'm Boyd Peterson. I'm the program coordinator for Mormon Studies here at UVU. For those of you who are on Twitter, our hashtag today is UVU Mormon. I was told that I needed to announce that. So welcome and thank you for coming. We'd like to thank a few people who've really helped out with this conference. As you can imagine, it takes a lot of people to put this kind of thing on. So we'd like to thank the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, the staff of the Ethics Center, especially Courtney Burns and Gabriel Toscano, our colleagues David Knowlton, who's been co-organizing and coordinating with us this semester with the Mormon Social Science Association, Blair Van Dyke, who's helped us a lot with coordinating student volunteers, David Scott, who's helped with planning, Galen Henderson, and others who are on the Religious Studies Committee. UVU has hosted a Mormon Studies conference ever since 2001, when Eugene England received a grant from the NEH. So those grants go here too, remember that. In calling your representatives and senators. When UVU got a grant from the NEH to study how to examine Mormonism in a public university. In the past few years, we've retooled our focus to study comparative and cross-cultural religious studies and interfaith dialogue. In the past, we've had conferences on Islam and Mormonism, Buddhism and Mormonism, Catholics and Mormonism, Mormonism and the Christian tradition. We've hosted Mormon evangelical dialogues. And so this conference dovetails nicely into our mission and where we're trying to go as a university, as a religious studies program. So the theme of this conference is multicultural Mormonism. And this started out because there's a kind of inevitable tension here in Mormonism, as there is in a lot of communities. Mormonism is called, like other Christians, to go into the world and preach the gospel. And so it's led to a very evangelical, a process of evangelizing the world. But the American-born religion has had to translate that faith and those practices into many different cultural contexts, and that's not always gone smoothly. This has led to debates about how to distinguish between core doctrines and rituals and the particularities of Utah-based Mormon culture. Today we're going to explore issues like how does a religious body promote cohesion and unity while at the same time allowing for inclusivity and diversity? To what extent is it possible for multiple cultures to work authentically in a single religious community? Can those identities thrive within a common gospel culture that maintain their unique languages and customs? To what extent are they vulnerable to cultural assimilation and alienation? So we're hoping to, I think you'll find that this conference explores these issues and more. Our first two presenters are Moroni Benally and Matthew Garrett. Moroni is the co-founder and executive board member of the Utah League of Native American Voters in Salt Lake City. He earned his undergraduate degree in international relations with an emphasis in comparative international political economy from Stanford, his master of public policy with an emphasis in social and economic policy from Brigham Young University, and he's completing a PhD at the University of Washington. He's also served as the executive director for the Navajo Nation Division of Natural Resources, managing the protection and conservation of the Navajo Nation's natural and cultural resources. Matthew Garrett is a professor of history at Bakersfield College in California. His research centers on race and ethnicity in the American West during the 19th and 20th centuries. He earned a bachelor's degree in history and in history education from Brigham Young University, a master's degree in American history from the University of Nebraska, and a PhD from Arizona State University in American history, with a research field in Native American history. In 2016, the University of Utah Press published his first monograph titled Making Lamanites, Mormons, Native Americans, and the Indian Student Placement Program. This award-winning book explores a unique foster care program for Indian children that was operated by the Mormon Church in the mid and late 20th century. So without further ado, please welcome Moroni.
Good morning. I had my coffee, have you? Just kidding. Maybe not. My name is Moroni Benally. Nashashin Slindo Batani Bashindo Tohane Dashido Tabanhe Dashinala Ado Twotla Content Nasha I say Adishimado Shia Oko Kutao I said the Ninshlen. So I also want to acknowledge the Ute tribe on whose lands that we are, given that we are talking about multicultural Mormonism and finding cohesion in that. We must not forget the lives and histories upon which this building is actually built. So the title of my talk is Decolonizing the Blossoming Indigenous People's Faith in a Colonizing Church. My grandfather was a medicine man, a practitioner of a ceremony called the Blessing Way, or Hozhonjin. The Blessing Way is described as the foundation of Navajo spirituality, the scriptures, if you will, of the people. The ceremony informs and organizes the spiritual life and community of the Navajo people. Singers or medicine men perform this ceremony in times of both joy and sadness. It reaffirms one's status as a child of eternal goodness and beauty, and the capacity for one to become eternal goodness and beauty themselves. It is the organizing force of Navajo. My grandfather's role as a singer for over 60 years was one of service. Singers or medicine people are not paid, nor do they expect remuneration for their work. Rather, they view what they do as a calling to ensure the fabric of Navajo society remains tightly woven around the broad notions of family, which also means happiness. My grandfather subsequently left this practice and joined the church at the age of 84. He described the doctrine of the church as pure as the dew in the morning. He noted that the ceremony he performed for decades felt incomplete. And once he heard the gospel, he felt there was some completion to that. The church doctrine made the Blessing Way ceremony complete for him. At the age of 87, he and my grandmother were sealed in the Mesa Temple. My father took him through the temple, and as my grandfather was washed, blessed, and anointed in the temple, he was overcome by emotion. My father accompanied him, translating the temple ceremony into Navajo for him, as at the time it wasn't translated in all the temples. My grandfather explained what occurred to him. He stated, "For years, our people have performed a similar ceremony. We would wash and anoint the people needing help on their loins, their lips, their eyes, their hands, by anointing them with corn pollen, and we would utter a similar prayer for them." And he explained the ceremony of the temple is the pure ceremony lost by our people. My grandfather's experience is not isolated. There are many other stories of indigenous spiritual experiences that appear to affirm for them the incompleteness of their own spiritual framework. My family took this respectful negotiating with the doctrines of the church and the place of the church within the broader context of colonization from my grandfather. He was not converted by missionaries. He was not converted by white people. Rather, he engaged with my father, his son, in a conversation that lasted 20 years about the Mormon Church. The local and regional leadership were ecstatic that a medicine man had joined the church in their realms, and they immediately began to use it as an example of the blossoming. My grandfather's story was immediately framed as a pioneer story, the implication being that now my family also had Mormon pioneer ancestry, which is really odd. This family raises several questions. One, to what extent has a Euro-American mythology of indigenous emergence and spirituality penetrated and replaced an indigenous mythos? What technologies are employed to operationalize that replacement? And why do Indigenous people remain in the church? In responding to these questions, we must engage the following: a theory of settler colonialism, the church, an understanding of the church as a settler colonial apparatus, and 3, Indigenous faith as an act of resistance. Settler colonialism. The central premise of the Book of Mormon is twofold. First, according to the church leadership curriculum and the book itself, it is to convince the Jew and the Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God. And second, it serves as a tool of erasure of Indigenous peoples' rightful claim to land, politics, economies, and access to power. These dual purposes often work together, the second often stemming from the first. This erasure and replacement is one facet of many of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism at its core is about elimination. The premise of settler colonialism, according to scholar Patrick Wolfe, is the elimination of the native from their land. Land is life, he argues. The logic of elimination not only refers to the summary liquidation of Indigenous people, though it includes that, settler colonialism has both negative and positive dimensions. Negatively, it strives for the dissolution of native societies. Positively, it erects a new colonial society in the expropriated land base. As I put it, Wolfe argues, settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event. The implications of this are vast for both the Indigenous and the church. Thus, the struggles of Native people in the United States becomes a struggle against their elimination, against their erasure. The implications, again, are vast, considering the Mormon expansion westward and their settlement in lands they did not own, but were promised. Indigenous scholars have read Mormonism as nothing more than a uniquely American structure of native elimination. And I'll push back on this notion a bit as I proceed through my talk. The theory of settler colonialism describes the structure of invasion and replacement. The Book of Mormon functions, again, as both a tool of invasion and replacement, but also, strangely, as an instrument of resistance against the church itself. If the Book of Mormon functions as a tool of epistemic and ontological invasion and replacement, the question can be posed, can one be indigenous and still believe in it? This is an important question to reflect on as it pushes back against the biopolitics and the biopolitical power operational within indigenous communities. One indigenous scholar described one important aspect of this tension as follows. One of the tactical moves of colonial discourse is to present the colonial subject as unchanging and immutable. And many indigenous scholars have themselves canonized tradition in their research. Such a focus is debilitating when predicated upon the search for a non-existent, authentic pre-colonial past. This tension is rather complicated. The Book of Mormon serves to both erase and renounce the unchanging and immutable tradition of the non-Mormon colonial discourse while seeking to build an authentic pre-colonial past of indigenous people, which by function also erases the history of the people. This mechanism remains complicated. It suggests there is no space of negotiation for the indigenous person to adopt, assimilate, and invite different belief systems into an already existing belief system. And if decolonization is about the decentering power out of spaces of whiteness and recentering power into indigenous spaces, then the capacity of indigenous conversion becomes an act of resistance against the structure of invasion. The church itself continues to assert itself as a colonizing institution. In 2007, Elder Holland spoke to a gathering of members of the Navajo Nation, stressing that they were Latter-day Saint first and Navajo second. Many Navajos at the time reacted with some degree of offense and hostility. After centuries of overt colonization, theft of land, theft of children, paternalistic governments, and church policies, this call to become worthy based on a Mormon logic of success, which cannot be separated from politics of whiteness, many felt they were being ignored and obviated. Latter-day Saint meant white, not Mormon. Not something that speaks to the spiritual center of the Navajo being. The biopower of the church in structuring identity under the premise of agency furthers the colonial reach of not only the church, but of the efforts of the U.S. itself. Instances of indigenous Mormon communities are replete with stories of local church leaders acting with impunity in ensuring the social structure of the church remains firmly locked within a Latter-day Saint logic of success. And any deviation of the use of indigenous spirituality to enhance their views of a gospel doctrine is often repudiated. Yet the paradox at play here is the attempt to control and structure the identity of faithful members of the church by making them abide by logics of white Latter-day Saint logic, while denying them acting in consonance with the core purpose of the Book of Mormon. It is at this moment that the Book of Mormon becomes both an agent of colonialism and a tool of resistance. Many, like my father, negotiated membership into the Mormon Church on their own terms, destabilizing the power of conversion politics. He further remained active on tenets of faith not necessarily consistent with the logic of Latter-day Saint success. Rather, his faith rested on what he considered the epistemic and ontological commensurability between Navajo and Mormonism. It was not governed by the promise of an afterlife or the inability, or was it about the inability of the Mormon faith to adequately grasp the meaning of family, especially in light of the meaning of sealings? His faith was not governed by historical inconsistencies, by debates on the Trinity or the nature of God, or on notions of grace and works, and so forth. Rather, his faith in the Mormon Church thrived on what it could add and complete in what he already believed and practice as a Navajo spiritual leader. What mattered to him was the Book of Mormon allowing him to be indigenous, even if his faith in being an Israelite was not complete. His faith was both loyal and an act of resistance. There are several modes of resistance that emerge from indigenous communities. Despite a church with a mythology designed to replace indigenous people, they resisted in significant but marginal ways. I don't know, can I say that? Significantly marginal? So passive noncompliance becomes a key mode of resistance and an act of faith within indigenous communities and their membership in the church. It is about recentering power. The biopolitical power of the church attempts to structure and dictate what is and is not culturally appropriate for an indigenous member of the church. For example, church leaders swiftly reprimand indigenous people for attending Native ceremony. Yet Native church members still participate, because for them it expands the central doctrines of the church around eternal connectedness or family. This is in response to the church's obsession with individuality and individuality's limited ability to understand the meaning of family in the context of the sealing. Ceremony provides the central core meaning that's missing from the lexicon of the church. As the notion of individualism is ultimately about, as well, upholding one of the tenets of whiteness. Thus, indigenous people continue to participate in their own ceremony because for them it is about expanding the meaning of church doctrine and their proximity to the core purposes of the Book of Mormon. Thus, this mode of resistance, this passive non-compliance, is premised on their faith in the Book of Mormon. And that becomes a central paradox, is the Book of Mormon allows them to get in touch with their own indigeneity and allows them to get closer to the core purposes of the Book of Mormon. Well, that is often viewed as a deviation from the central logic of what it means to be a Latter-day Saint. And you have these two things functioning. And so faith becomes an act of resistance. And so the blossoming, I'll conclude with this, the blossoming is controlled and strictly guarded by the church leadership and the logic of whiteness undergirding its approach to the faith. And for those who may not be familiar, the blossoming of the rose is a promise that at some point the children of Father Lehi will receive all whatever blessings are guaranteed them through covenant of some sort. But the blossoming logic, I'm arguing, according to the church, must be consistent with the principles of erasing indigenous people from their land, which has been stolen, and must also be about the church being able to deflect complicity in the theft of that land. And so it severely limits the idea of what the blossoming is. Therefore, the blossoming must be consistent with a logic of the white Latter-day Saint, which is the prevailing logic. It must be controlled, this blossoming must be controlled, policed, and identified only by the power centers of Mormonism. In my short presentation, I've suggested that faith as resistance is about bucking this Latter-day Saint logic and reclaiming ownership of the narrative of the children of that's around the children of Father Lehi, and by extension, defining for themselves the criteria that constitutes the blossoming. In many indigenous circles, the blossoming has been expressed as a political, economic, sociological phenomenon, and it is not limited simply to the spiritual. Precisely this because indigenous ontology sees no distinction between the spiritual, the political, the economic, or the sociological. They are all related. Thus, simply being attentive to their own moral framework and folding Mormonism into that act becomes a threat to the logic, to the Latter-day Saint logic that is at the core of the church today. And so indigenous people and their interactions with Mormonism is obviously complex and complicated. What I have shared here is not to dismiss or diminish the views of those who are not part of the church, but whose lives have been traumatically disrupted in real and significant ways because of the colonizing influence of the church. Yet I wanted to emphasize that there are various ways of resisting, and the church must come to terms that faith itself among indigenous peoples is an act of resistance to the central Latter-day Saint logic. Thank you.